Ladies and gentlemen, tonight Mr. Huxley speaks to us of a world of visionary experience. Mr. Huxley.
I want to begin this talk with one of those questions which inquisitive children ask their parents and stump them completely. So a question like, why is grass green? But this is a question about precious stones. Why are precious stones precious? And obviously it's extremely difficult to find any rational reason for this. There's certainly no economic reason, no biological reason why people should have spent an immense amount of time, energy, and money on collecting and cutting and setting colored pebbles. And there must be some much deeper psychological reason for this strange behavior. Now, this question was asked many years ago by Santayana, who came up with what seems to me a partial explanation, but I don't think it's a complete final explanation. He said that in his opinion, precious stones were precious because they seemed to man to be the nearest approach in this world of perpetual perishing, of passing away. They seem to be the nearest approach to the permanent and the eternal. A precious stone does appear to remain exactly as it is, generation after generation. And Santayana assumed that it was because this was the nearest approach in our world to something that was intrinsically eternal, that the precious stone took on its precious quality. Well, I think there is something in this explanation, but I don't think it's by any means the complete story. I think there are other compelling psychological reasons why we value precious stones as we do. I'm going to quote a passage from Plato, which I think throws a lot of light on this subject. It comes from the Phaedon, the dialogue. And here, Socrates is talking about the ideal world, which he says is more beautiful and real than the actual world in which we live. And he says, in this other earth, the colors are much purer and more brilliant than they are down here. And the very mountains and stones have a richer gloss and lovelier transparency and intensity of hue. The precious stones of this lower world are highly prized cornelians, jaspers, emeralds, and all the rest, are but the tiny fragments of these stones above. In the other world there is no stone but is precious and exceeds in beauty every gem of ours. And he goes on to say, the vision of this world is a vision of blessed beholders. Well, this seems to me a very interesting passage, inasmuch as it makes perfectly clear that the ideal world of Plato is not a mere metaphysical construction, a kind of inference from the facts of our present world and its imperfection. It is a visible world, a world which can be seen with the inner eye and which has certain describable peculiarities, such as the colors being much brighter and it being filled with stones which are very like our precious stones. And I find here probably what is the basic psychological reason for our immensely high valuation of precious stones, which is this, that these are the objects in the natural world which most nearly resemble things which are seen with the inner eye by people who have the gift of vision, and which even those who do not consciously have the gift of vision have some kind of unconscious inkling of. It seems to, as it were, remind them of something going on in the back of their minds, which on a subterranean level they know something about. And we get a certain confirmation of this by the greatest of the Neoplatonic philosophers, Plotinus, who says that everything in the intelligible world, which is much the same as the ideal world of Plato, everything there shines. And he says that for this reason, the most beautiful thing in this world is fire, which is a transference, as we see, from the inner facts of the visionary world into the outer fact. This is a transference of value from something which is highly esteemed in the inner world into the outer world. And says the most beautiful thing in this world is fire. And it's interesting to find, for example, in Ezekiel's description of the Garden of Eden, he speaks of it being filled with gems, filled with what he calls stones of fire. As I hope to show later on, this richness of gem-like qualities which is found in the visionary world does explain many very strange facts about certain types of art, and many facts about the curious uniform quality of religious traditions, folklore traditions, traditions of the nature of the golden age and the afterlife, which are found all over the world. We'll talk about that later. Meanwhile, let us speak about the accessibility of this visionary world. Well, we look at the records and we look around and we find that a certain number of people can enter this visionary world spontaneously, that they can go back and forth between the two worlds without any real difficulty, and that probably quite a lot of children inhabit the visionary world for quite a bit of the time. And also we find that this visionary world is very highly prized by people, and that they will go out of their way to get into it. That if they do not visit it spontaneously, they do a great many things which help them to go into it artificially. The visionary experience is so highly prized that throughout the ages of recorded history, people have done their best to induce visions. They've tried to go to this other world by various artificial vehicles. And there are a number of ways which have been worked out. There are psychological ways, there are physiological ways, there are chemical ways. And it's worth, I think, describing a few of these methods. For example, it is possible to go into the other world through hypnosis. Quite a number of people can, in a certain stage, a rather deep stage of hypnosis, can and do enter some kind of visionary world. It's a very interesting experience if one has ever watched people suddenly passing out of what seems to be a kind of sleep-like stage into a world where they are seeing very clearly very strange and interesting things. I think this hypnotic visionary world is probably not quite so brilliant and extraordinary as some of the other visionary worlds, the other aspects of the visionary world which can be touched in other ways. And then, of course, there are the purely psychological methods. There are the methods of intensive concentration, which we find in the various yogas of the East and in the so-called spiritual practices of the West, which do undoubtedly produce these visionary states. Then there is the method which has been employed in many, many parts of the world, the method of complete isolation, the limiting, the cutting down of sensory experiences to the greatest possible extent. And now this is a very interesting thing. Within the last few years, a number of experiments have been made in modern psychological and medical laboratories with what is called limited environment. That, for example, people like Hebb at McGill and Dr. Lilly at the National Institute of Health in Washington have employed various means for cutting down the input of sensory stimuli to the extreme limit. Lilly, for example, cut down external stimuli to such a point that there was nothing practically that was affecting him from without. He immersed himself completely in a bath of warm water to a temperature of 94, breathed through a snorkel so that his face was completely covered, therefore no part of his skin was feeling anything except a uniform temperature. He tied himself up in a harness which didn't permit him to move more than 1/10 of an inch. He was in a light-proof and soundproof room, where the interesting fact is that within 4 hours, he and those colleagues of his who submitted to this extremely drastic treatment were seeing very, very strange visions. Where the deprivation of external stimuli is not quite so complete as it was in Hebb's experiments, similar visions will be seen within 24 to 36 hours. Now, one of the interesting facts here is that the great majority of these visions were extremely unpleasant. They were so unpleasant that I've asked Dr. Lilly what they were, and he has always declined to tell me. I don't know what they must have been very unpleasant indeed. But now this is extremely interesting in view of the historical facts. We find, both in the East and the West, a long tradition of isolation, that hermits and would-be visionaries have retired to the most desolate places where they could cut off an enormous amount of external stimuli. In the 4th century, in the Thebaid in Egypt, immense numbers of hermits and Cenobites lived in the desert, cutting themselves off as far as possible from external stimuli. And we see the same thing with the Tibetan lamas and the Hindu monks in caves and in remote places in the Himalayas, and that they did it all for the same reason. And again, what is very interesting is that we find from the records that a great many of these monks of the Thebaid had visions, and had extremely painful and disagreeable visions. In virtually every picture gallery of the world you will see paintings of the Temptations of St. Anthony, which are diabolic visions which have thronged in upon the saint. He did have a certain number of beatific visions, but he had also a great many of these very unpleasant visions. And it's interesting to find the historical records confirming everything that has been found in recent years by laboratory work. Over and above these psychological methods, there are a number of physiological methods of inducing visions by changing body chemistry. One of the strange facts is that by inducing certain changes in body chemistry, we do appear to open the door, so to say, which separates our ordinary everyday selves from this remote visionary area of the mind. One of the ways, the physiological methods, is of course the method practiced in the Orient, the method of breathing exercises. Well, all breathing exercises culminate in one thing, which is prolonged suspensions of breath, which may last a minute, several minutes even. But when there are such prolonged suspensions of breath, there is naturally an increase of carbon dioxide in the blood. And it is now well known that an increase of carbon dioxide, either induced in this way or else brought to the blood by inhalation, does produce very strange visionary psychological experiences. So that we see again here that these time-honored yogic methods have been again confirmed by recent laboratory work, showing that if you do something which increases the CO2 in the blood, you do automatically give yourself access to this visionary world. Then again, there's the question of fasting. Here, in many cultural traditions, fasting has been used precisely for the purpose of creating a visionary experience. The red man in this country habitually and systematically resorted to fasting for the express purpose of achieving visionary experience. It was one of the initiation rites of young men in many of the Indian tribes. And of course fasting has been used to a very considerable extent in all the major religions. Similarly, lack of sleep, cutting down on sleep, will also produce effects of this same kind. And even some of the more violent physical austerities, such as self-flagellation, also, I think, produce certain chemical changes which facilitate the coming of visions. For example, a violent self-flagellation will release great quantities of histamine, great quantities of adrenaline, both of which may have profound psychological effects. When we look back on the history of religious practices and the desire for visions which has existed, I think, in all cultures, we see that these curious ways of facilitating the visionary experience have been employed, and we now know the reasons, in as far as they are biochemical, we know the reasons why these practices were adopted. Beyond these methods of inducing visionary experiences, there are the directly chemical methods. And here again, there is an enormous history in this field. Anybody who wishes to know the detailed story of it, I recommend a very interesting book by the French anthropologist Philippe de Félis called Poisons Sacrés, Sacred Poisons, which is an account of all the purely chemical methods used in both civilized and primitive cultural traditions for the purpose of getting people into the visionary state. Every kind of substance has been used for this purpose, and the interesting fact is that in the past, the majority of these substances, these mind-changing, vision-inducing substances, have been dangerous. Opium, of course, is a dangerous substance. Even dear old alcohol is a dangerous substance when used to the extent which it has been in the various religious traditions. Coca is a dangerous substance. Hashish is a fairly dangerous substance. And many of them have certainly been effective in producing a visionary experience, but have been effective at very considerable cost to the physiology. People have paid a great price. Even the traditional Hindu drug, the drug soma, which is described in the Vedas, this produced certain visionary effects without any doubt. But it was so poisonous that even the great god Indra felt extremely ill after taking too much soma, and that ordinary mortals could actually die of it. This really startling fact about recent pharmacological developments is that a number of chemical substances have been discovered in recent years which permit the opening of the door into the visionary world without inflicting serious damage upon the body. Enormous changes in consciousness can be brought about without hurting the body. And this is an extraordinary fact. Some of these substances are related to substances existing in nature. For example, mescaline is the active principle now synthesized in the Indian peyote. And incidentally, peyote is one of the few traditional mind-changing drugs which has been taken for many centuries by the Indians and whose use is spreading now throughout the western United States right up into Canada. Has been taken without producing addiction, without causing degeneration among those who take it. And beyond this synthetic mescaline, there are various others, lysergic acid, the most recent of them being the active principle of the sacred Mexican mushroom, which was synthesized by Hoffmann in Basel in Switzerland. My friend, Professor Roger Haim of Paris, the mycologist, told me that he had recently returned from Mexico and had gone down to visit an old witch doctoress friend there, bringing her a number of the pills which Hoffmann had synthesized, and had given her some of these pills, which she'd taken, and was quite delighted because they produced exactly the same effect as the mushrooms, and she was more especially delighted that now she could practice her magic every season of the year instead of having to wait for the mushroom season. So that this is one of the great triumphs of modern science, that a witch doctor in Mexico will be able to send a postcard to Dr. Hoffman in Basel saying, "Have important magic to do, please send 100 capsules for airmail." Well, these are some of the chemical ways of opening this door which leads into the other part of the mind. Experiments, of course, have been made by eminent psychologists for a long time. William James, for example, made considerable experiments with nitrous oxide, and incidentally was much blamed by some of his colleagues for such a frivolous undertaking and for taking it so seriously, and was defended by Bergson in his Two Sources of Religion and Ethics, where he said we must remember that the nitrous oxide was not the cause of Professor James's remarkable experiences. It was the occasion that it removed certain obstacles which permitted this other material to come through. The obstacles could have been removed by purely psychological means or by other psychophysical means, but this particular means did open the door, and the nature of the experience which came through is not affected by the nature of the key which is used to open the door. And this is a very interesting passage in Bergson, and I think it's fundamentally true that although there seems to be something rather discreditable and unfair, so to say, about the possibility of opening the door by a means so simple as psilocybin or LSD 25, yet there seems to be no reason to doubt that what comes through is of the same nature as what comes through via breathing exercises or fasting or any other means. Now, let us briefly talk about the nature of the experience. Now, of course, every visionary experience is unique, as every human being is unique, but these things do not occur at random. Although they are unique, and although there are considerable variations, yet we do recognize in the majority of these experiences a kind of family likeness. They belong to a certain class. And we realize this very well if we read such a book as Heinrich Klüver's book, monograph on peyote, Beringer's book on peyote, a whole mass of religious literature on visions and so forth. We see that there is a kind of resemblance running through this whole family of experiences. And I think we can say that the highest common factor in all these experiences is the experience of light. Now, the light experience is of several kinds. There is the experience, which is recorded in a great deal of the literature, of what may be called undifferentiated light, just an enormous burst of light, unembodied in any particular form, just a great flood of light. I think it would be true to say that this experience of the undifferentiated light is generally associated with what may be called a full-blown theophany or a full-blown mystical experience, that experience which transcends the subject-object relationship, which produces a sense of solidarity between the experiencer and the universe, which gives the experiencer a sense of the basic all-rightness of the universe, an understanding of such a phrase as occurs in the book of Job, "Yea, though he slay me, yet will I trust in him." This is, seems to me, a characteristic feature of the mystical experience. And this kind of experience and the experience of the same order when associated and interpreted in terms of a theological frame of reference, when the experience is interpreted in Christian terms as the unity of knowledge of God, this kind of experience is, as a matter of fact, generally associated with this experience of undifferentiated light. And of course this kind of light experience is recorded again and again in the literature. The most familiar case is the case of St. Paul on the road to Damascus. We find Muhammad's call to being a prophet came when he woke up in the middle of the night, perceiving a light so intense that it caused him to swoon away. Plotinus entered several times into the light and was, as he says, swallowed up in divinity. We find Dante describing paradise as being illumined as though by two suns. I mean, there is the ordinary sun, and then there is this other light, which is like the light of a much more powerful sun coming through the ordinary sunlight. Then in more recent times we find the tremendous light experience of St. John of the Cross when he was confined by his brethren to prison in Toledo. And Jacob Boehme records light experiences of this same kind. And one could find, I think, without any difficulty, hundreds, literally hundreds, of such experiences recorded by eminent or less eminent mystics.